So I'm going to introduce the next speaker now. So our next speaker is excuse me, is Jesús Siqueiros. I hope I pronounced your name right. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. An anthropologist and an A-lifer who works with complex networks, computational models, and social sciences in Mexico. So Jesús, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen there? Sure. Okay, excellent. Okay, great. Well, this is the, thank you for the presentation, and this is just a wonderful group of discussing so interesting things. So I really love to be here today, this morning here in Mexico. So the title of my presentation is You Robot, Empathy in a Hybrid World, which after some revision from the comments of the reviewers, I think part of the content has changed, and well, I still hope that is something interesting to say about this. So let me, sorry. Okay, well, this presentation is about our interaction with others, about the role of presence and the emergence of otherness, and the creation synthesis of interactions that are giving oneself to the other. Let me, there's something here I cannot change. Sorry. Okay, good. So just let me tell you something before about this. Okay, so basically I'm interested in the problem of otherness and presence, and actually I've been working a little bit on these ideas more in the context of the performing arts, for example, and I think that this is also an interesting problem in the case of robotics, and especially what I call, or it has been called like this during this morning, as potential, or as artificial others. So I will concentrate on how can that happen, the idea of otherness and presence, and how can we have these or create these interactions that allow giving oneself to the other in the context of potential artificial others. So, okay, there we go. This presentation elaborates over the comments of the reviewers, for which I am very, very grateful. I would like to say that I would like to go deeper into the comments and have elaborate more on them, but still I hope that I cover part of their concerns. So for me, the question is, what would be an artificial other? What makes an artificial other? And well, I will start from here, saying from this phenomenological perspective, saying that according to Heidegger, our basic form of engagement with the world is in terms of doing. Our engagement is primarily pragmatic. So tools, things, and equipment in general are transparent. For example, when I use a hammer to get a nail on the wall, the hammer, if I am skilled enough, is transparent to me. All my attention goes to the actions of hammering without noticing the hammer itself. And if I am very skilled, I might not even paying attention to hammering. Maybe I'll think about something completely different. Tools, things, and equipment usually lose their transparency. They break in from the background when something goes wrong, when they get broken, for example. So while riding my bicycle, I'm not be aware of it, and I can go enjoying the landscape. If one of the tires go flat, then the bicycle breaks into my attention. So robots in general may be in the category of tools, things, and equipment, and they are expected to remain transparent in the background of things where they perform what they are designed to do. If they rub from the background, it might be due to some malfunction. So, and this might be simplistic or oversimplistic, but no one would think a hammer, a bicycle, or an industrial robot as another. So I suggest that this might be different in the case of hybrid robots, where eruption is the result of some form of genuine emergent behavior, a form of making themselves present by themselves. So hybrid robots would be in some point between heteronomy and autonomy, and this is it would be like not a definition of hybrid robots, but it will be like the idea I had about what would be a hybrid robot. So this would be systems that by design have been imposed a set of norms to behave in a particular way for some external goal, but taking advantage of the benefits of autonomy, for example, self-maintenance and self-repair. And Xenobots can be a case of it. These Xenobots, maybe you have heard of them because they have been talked about in former A-Life conferences, where they're taking some based on already cell forms, and they're constrained in a way to behave in certain ways, right? They may be like oversimplistic definition of Xenobot that Michael Levin wouldn't like what I just said, but anyway, that's the basic idea. So hybrid robots with some autonomy in the strong sense of autopoietic and enactivist theory may make themselves present in unintended ways seen from their design and use perspective. A strong sense of autonomy means that the self-maintenance is a matter of concern to the system because there is a part of its identity that depends on its organization. Autonomy means that the system has defined a domain of existence that is meaningful to it. Such domain may offer open-ended possibilities of realization to the system and new forms of engagement with its environment, one that is meaningful engagement. Hybrid robots, new forms of engagement, may appear to the observer as eruptions to the expected behavior and as malfunction to be fixed. But on the other hand, the eruption into the life world of humans may be seen as a basic and primitive form of presence, as it creates a shared space of interaction between two autonomous systems. This is the robot and the observer, designer, or user. The act by which it makes itself present is relevant as long as the action is emergent from the system environment organization and responds to the concern of the system for the self-maintenance of its organization. That is, going back to what I just said, it means it's a concern about maintaining its identity. Therefore, the act by which it is making itself present from the perspective of the robot must be an act of sense-making. In the case of social robots, eruption may be perceived as an expression of subjectivity, a source of otherness to which we will have to learn to relate. Subjectivity, in this case, is related to those acts that are attached or are dependent to the particular perspective of the system in a process of sense-making, not as a reflective ego cogito subjectivity. That is, this notion of subjectivity is not the one of a narrative self. They said, I am, or it's not a self or not a subject in terms of I think. Right? It's more about the engagement, the pragmatic, the doing relationship with the world. So eruption in social robots may lead to a stronger sense of presence. As in Damiano and Damuchel 2020, social presence is defined as a robot capability to give the user the sense of being with another. And they take this definition from Bioka and colleagues. There are different ways to provoke that sense of on the side of the user. For example, it could be realistic movements from the side of the robot. The notion of presence I have in mind might be a particular case of Bioka and colleagues' definition. Social presence would be the eruption from the world of things, the act of the robot in search for the other and a demand of attention to be perceived as a you. To be perceived as a you is related to the self-maintenance and autonomy of the robot, presence that does not respond to design. So these are some questions that at the end, I don't have a good answer for them, but I think that they're important. So when can we refer to robots as artificial others? Is it necessary such demand on the side of the robot in robot-human interactions for artificial otherness? Are there other possibilities of artificial otherness that is not so stringent? So the challenge is that the tension between design behavior and authentic, autonomous, open-ended behavior will place us in a situation for ethical learning about a new form of otherness. With basic forms of presence in social robots, we may address it as a malfunction to be fixed, or coerced, should I say. This in itself begs for an ethical response. With more elaborated forms of presence, we need to reflect on the possibility of intersubjectivity with artificial others, with forms of otherness that are brewed by us, yet strange and original. So what are the things that I missed? I probably missed a lot of things in this presentation. Then probably there are many things that I'm not even aware of that I should have paid more attention. But some of them is that what would be a hybrid social robot? How is the nature of its implementation? I would definitely need to work on the notion of hybridity from the perspective of the interaction itself. What is a hybrid robot-human interaction? Is it that we're going to think about the relationship itself as an autonomous system, for example, right? That is hybrid in itself. And that is independent from any implementation of the case of the side of the robot. So also, I would definitely need to go deeper into developmental robotics and effective social robotics, because I know that they have been working on these subjects very much for a long time. So just to finish, I agree with Michelle and Damiano that reflecting about social robotics is also a form of anthropology. It is an invitation to reflect about the other. It is also an invitation for a different way of doing ethics, and which they call synthetic ethics, right? So just to finish, I don't know if I still have time. I guess maybe a couple of minutes. Good, thank you. I also think that reflecting about this otherness in the case of artificial others is interesting, because it can be extended, actually, like Damiano and Michelle have pointed before in their book, on actually how do we relate to others, especially, for example, how do we relate to minorities, or historically the relationship, for example, between Europeans and original populations in the Americas, for example, right? And I think it actually can extend about the idea of otherness and agency, and how, for example, when we relate to others, we actually we are open to let others to express their otherness and agency and subjectivity in a way that we can have much more empathetic relationships with others, right? So I think that the case of robotics, artificial otherness, it's a wonderful example to reflect on this, but also it can be extended to a wider set of contexts that deserve to be attended. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really great. We have about 5 minutes right now, if there's any questions that arise right away for our speaker. So feel free to, there's options. You can raise your hand, or you can type in chat, or you can type in a Q&A section of the Zoom room.
I think someone has their hand up. I don't know if they have a question.
Oh, right. Sorry,
I will allow them to talk. That's fine. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, Kostadin, yeah.
Thank you for sharing the link to Cenobots.
So you're muted in case you're talking.
Oh.
No, sorry,
no.
That was a mistake from my side.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you. Okay. We cannot hear Kostadin. In case.
Oh, here's a question.
No, I don't have a question. I misclicked. Sorry about that.
Oh,
Okay, good.
There's a
Right. So
question.
if one, maybe there is one. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe Lisa, will you read it?
Yeah. Excuse me. Right. So the comment is there's in this area, for example, the section that the session addresses this is most likely fully possible to influence development of future AI to be more like a partner. Like in a sense of Chris Landauer's presentation in lifelike computing workshop yesterday, for human way of life rather than just employees for conducting individual tasks. Right. Jesus, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, that definitely that's exactly the idea about this. A bit more. Yeah, what I think interesting is that is interesting is this idea of being a partner, right? Is that we can open this spectrum of what can be and who can be a partner, and not limited only. I mean, actually, yesterday working on this presentation, I was thinking about how different is think about this otherness in the case of robots from what, like I was mentioning before, the different populations encountering themselves. For example, the Europeans encountering the encounter with the American original population, right? And I mean, for each side, and I think there's work on that. Like, for example, this anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, right, working on that topic, talking about they were completely different, and the Aztecs, for example, they would stay and they would keep the bodies of the dead Spaniards next to them to see if they would rot exactly like themselves when they were dead, right? To see if they were made of the same thing, if they were same. So I think that the confrontation to otherness has always been there at some point in history. And the interesting thing is that if we actually want to think about partners, that might be like to being open to this really diverse way of being a self, no? And for that matter, regardless of being bone and flesh and in the form of a human. I guess, yeah, that's an interesting point. Absolutely.
Yeah, Olaf.
So yeah, I guess my question is about. I think it's the last point of in your paper when you talk about domestication. So I consider that when I use a phone, or when I use any tool right in my hand, I kind of extend my cognition to this other thing, and extend my autonomy as well, and maybe I extend my heteronomy as well. There are tiny, I guess, distinctions between them. But what is the difference between, I guess, extending this kind of autonomy and reaching for something that has its own autonomy, like an AI or a pet or a friend or another A-lifer you're discussing with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, I think it comes all to the idea of how do we address the world in general, and how we address inanimate things, for example, right? And I think that will be the case of having the cell phone on the mobile, or having my mug on my hand and addressing the other. And for the case of the pets or a friend of another A-lifer, the thing is that from this point of view of what I'm presenting here is actually that the other is not only about us recognizing the mind, or trying to understand the mind of the other, but actually that in being an other, or being in this case a subject or a self, it also demands the attention. And we actually, from a very 4E perspective, we actually use ourselves, our bodies, to call it, for example, in this way, to invite the other to see us as a potential you for. So at the end, what I think that will be like a great difference in how we address others as others and not as simply a monk or a mobile. The thing is that from what I have seen from cognitive science, for example, is that very much in understanding the social cognition is that we focus on how do we address the mind of others. But from this perspective, actually, is how do I invite the other to see me as a self to which you can have a legitimate interaction, right? So that will be the difference for me.
Great, thank you. There's more comments, but we should stay on track with our schedule. There will be time to come back and have a larger discussion, but also Jesus, feel free to answer in the chat or in a Q&A form as well. All right, wonderful. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Carlos Gershenson, professor in computer science department at the Institute of Research in Applied Mathematics and in Systems at the University at UNAM in Mexico. Carlos's talk is titled "On the Scales of Selves, Information, Life, and Buddhist Philosophy." I'm gonna now transfer all the power to Carlos.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks for the organizers and especially Olaf, who motivated me to develop these ideas and present here. So first, I will share some of the previous ideas on information theory, on life and artificial life, and Buddhist philosophy, and later to integrate them on the discussion of selves and how can we study them at different scales. And I guess that's the main question here would be, what's the best scale to describe life? Because I mean, when we try to define living systems, either artificial or biological, we tend to draw a boundary between the self, that which is alive, and its environment. So, for example, the definition of autopoiesis precisely draws this distinction, and the membrane is explicit about the boundary between the self and its environment. And also concepts like individuality, autonomy, and agency are deeply related to the notion of self, because you need this distinction in order to speak about all these ideas. So I guess that the discussion of selves is central to the discussion of life. It would be very difficult to discuss life or artificial life without distinguishing precisely what's the self and what's the environment. And we can ask where to draw this boundary. I mean, we know that this is arbitrary from general system theory, that it's arbitrary where you draw the boundaries of a system. And some people draw it at the cells scale, or at the organism scale, or societies or colonies, or maybe species or ecosystems, but perhaps also at the biosphere level, or maybe we can also speak about molecules like prions and viruses to have a certain selfhood, even if many people don't consider them alive. And about information, I like this quote from James Blake: "Long-run history is the story of information becoming aware of itself." And since information can be defined as anything that an agent can sense, perceive, or observe, we can describe everything in terms of information. So we can develop so-called laws of information that can be generalized to study evolution, life, minds, and agency at different scales. So instead of trying to start from matter and energy, which is what physics studies, and then trying to understand what's cognition, what is mind, what is agency, we will fall into a dualism, because matter and energy doesn't have many of the properties that we observe in living systems. So to avoid these dualisms, I mean, we can say that information, including meaning, let's say, can describe cognition and life. But we don't need to start outside of information. We can start already with information and see matter and energy as particular types of information, and then we avoid dualisms. And especially soft artificial life naturally is described in terms of information. And Kierkegaard wrote that life is understood backwards but must be lived forwards. And we can say that living is information processing. We have a paper with Keith Farnsworth and James Nelson about this. Of course, there are many ways of describing life, but one of the keys of artificial life is that we can abstract the substrate of living systems and replace it with software or hardware or whatware, and then study the properties. We could call them the informational properties or the organizational properties of living systems, independently of their substrate. And like this, one proposal is to measure the life ratio as the amount of information that an agent produces by itself over the amount of the information that it's produced by its environment. So let's say this distinction between self and environment is also key in this notion of life. And entering into Buddhism, I like this quote of Schrödinger that, as far as I know, he was not Buddhist, or at least not openly, but what he says here is precisely, can be interpreted as Buddhist idea. The world is given to me only once, not one existing and one perceived. Subject and object are only one. The barrier between them cannot be said to have broken down as a result of present experience in the physical sciences, for this barrier does not exist. And this is precisely what Thomas was saying, that there's no distinction between object, subject, and action, but it's rather an illusion. So this is what Schrödinger was also saying, or we could say rediscovering. And I mean, it's extremely quick summary of Buddhist philosophy. I mean, we can say that Buddhist philosophy has studied the mind for more than 2,500 years. And there are different types of philosophies, different schools. The three main ones are Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. And we could say that they're complementary. The Hinayana focuses on the individual, Mahayana focuses on others, what's my relationship to others, so it focuses on compassion and wisdom. And Vajrayana looks beyond boundaries, so basically it dissolves distinctions. And so it's not new to relate ideas from Buddhism in cognitive science. Francisco Varela was a practicing Buddhist, and he co-organized these workshops on mind and matter, I believe they were called, that the Dalai Lama also participated. So I mean, there have been many studies already for several decades, also on Buddhist monks or long-term practitioners of meditation. And also there are many ideas on what enlightenment is. One of them is that the ego, or let's say the self, is just an illusion, meaning that it's not real. Precisely because what Thomas was saying, that it's changing constantly. So once we realize that, we become enlightened. The problem is that we have habits and tendencies, and we believe that we are real and that we exist, and then we make all sorts of mistakes because of that. And if we accept that the separation between object, subject, and action is an illusion, then also several Buddhist teachers say that space is information, or space is potential, and then we can also see information as potential. So instead of interpreting information just, for example, as a sequence of bits, zeros and ones, information can also be seen as the potential of having values of either 0 and 1. So with information, you can potentially describe everything. And now to speak about scales, I mean, we can describe the same phenomena at different scales, but all of them are relevant. And in this diagram, we can see that the lower scales, so elementary particles, atoms, and so on, those would be the lowest scales. The highest scales would be the universe. so the lower scales needs more and more information because we need to give more details. We have more distinctions, and as we increase the scale, we are basically losing information. We are generalizing. We're losing distinctions. So in the high scale, we're basically don't need any information because everything is included there. However, at the lowest scale, since we have potentially infinite information, then everything is possible. So the question would be, okay, what's the right scale to study life? Because one could interpret Dharmakaya, which is the Buddha truth states, as being the highest scale, where everything is included, so form is emptiness. And then at the lowest scale, everything is possible, so emptiness is form. And let's say, to say that everything is included, then everything becomes a tautology. So you don't need information. And then everything that is there already, let's say, it cannot be false. But that's because you made an abstraction and you basically erased all distinctions. So it's interesting, but in specific instances, it might be not the most practical scale. And this quote of Poincaré, already relating to selves, he said, the aim of science is not things themselves, as the dogmatism, their simplicity imagined, but relations among things. Outside this relation, there's no reality knowable. And this to say that we cannot study things in isolation. So of course we are interested in selves, but we cannot define selves in isolation from their environment because it's related to other selves and to other things and to other scales. So we could define life at the cellular level, as many biologists do. However, we usually define cognition at the organism level. I mean, swarm intelligence would study cognition at the colony level. But we can say that the immune system has cognition at the molecular level because it recognizes the difference between self and non-self, but at the molecular level. But of course, here we need to use downward causation, which say I would sidetrack into a different discussion speaking about downward causation, but I think we also need to include it in this discussion of scales of self, because it's not only bottom-up, but also top-down causation. And we can also discuss selves in terms of information. So for example, gliders in the game of life. And depending on the scales at which we describe selves, we can identify different types of scales. So for example, structural scales, which are related to metasystem transitions, those are, let's say, already mentioned and relatively obvious. So cells, tissues, and so on, all the way to biospheres. And we could try to study at each of these scales purpose. What's the purpose of a cell? What's the purpose of a biosphere? Goals, agency, individuality, cognition. And I put consciousness with a question mark because I don't really know what consciousness is. So I wouldn't be able to start studying it in a different scales. But anyway, if we agree on some pragmatic definition of consciousness, then we could also start trying to study it at different scales. And we also know that evolution and selection act at different scales. And also we see that cooperation can be described easily within cells and conflict between cells. So even in social groups, usually cooperation is in-group and conflict is out-group. So in that sense, perhaps the self would be the groups rather than the individuals, because many ideas from the evolution of cooperation only look at one scale, and probably it would be interesting to look at multiple scales in parallel. And apart from structural scales, we can consider temporal scales. So the cells change at different speeds at different scales. So some of our molecules change with every breath. Some of our cells, like neutrophils, change every few days. And some of our cells and some of our memories last a lifetime. What is maintained is not the components of our body, but our organization. And this can be represented in terms of information. So what also Thomas was saying is that we have this continuity, and even when my components have changed, most of them, I still consider that I'm the same as 30 years ago. And our bodies are only one type of organization. There can be other types of organization at different scales. And of course, I don't know how to call the lifetime of a species or a biosphere, but I think we can also include very long time scales. And this leads us to informational scales. I mean, we can also look in this diagram between different scales, between lower and higher. We can include more or less distinctions. More distinction is a lower scale, but we need more information. And if we lose distinctions or information, we are moving to a higher scale. And my personal interpretation of reincarnation, that it seems to conflict with some of our understandings of in the Western world, is basically you have the same information but different instances. So depending how we describe ourselves, we might be changing constantly. I mean, that I'm already different person than I was 5 minutes ago if we go to a very low scale, because some of my atoms already changed, some of my molecules already changed, some of my cells already changed, or we might not change at all. So if we lose even more details, then we lose distinctions between individuals, so we can just stack different individuals in the same category, like all Mexicans, or all humans, or all animals, or all cells. And it's like, if we have 4 apples and 4 pears, there are different instances, but it's the same concept 4. So in a similar way, if we have some information that can be characterized for a person, then this is not necessarily restricted to instance like a body. So let's say one way of interpreting reincarnation is that you can have this same organization or this same information in different bodies, not necessarily at the same time, but in different times. And then it's like saying all the Mexicans living here, or all the Mexicans who have ever lived, and then you just put them in the same category. And this separation of cells from the environment is artificial, but it's also practical, and I would say even necessary. And the best scales of descriptions of cells will be those at which the decisions are made. So this is a pragmatic approach. So we will not say, okay, the individual or the cellular or whatever scale is the best. It depends on what we're interested. So for example, if we want to make decisions about our biosphere and climate change, we might better forget about our personal issues and our individuality. But if we're hungry, we have to focus on sustaining our decaying bodies. So it's just pragmatical. And to conclude, I would say that cells are arbitrary, but that doesn't mean that they're not useful. They're, I would say, essential to study life. However, they depend on the scale at which they are described. Some descriptions will be more useful than others. And it's precisely, again, this idea that you cannot separate the object, the subject, and action. You cannot say that a self as an object is independent of another self that is describing that self. I mean, of course, it could be self-describing itself. So depending on the subject describing the self, the object can change. I mean, it's simply a way of saying that the same phenomena can have different descriptions. We can describe a cell as a complex system or as a Boolean variable or another description. And the usefulness of different descriptions or the different scales is context dependent. So I think we will be less incomplete if we consider different cells at different scales in parallel, rather than trying to stick with a single scale.
Great, thank you so much, Carlos.